The influential speech Captain Ibrahim Traoré at the Russian-Africa Summit. In the world of international diplomacy, speeches are usually pretty boring. They're carefully written, sanded down, and stripped of anything that might sound like a real human emotion. They're meant to reassure, not to challenge. To keep things as they are, not to flip the table over. So what happens when a 35-year-old soldier, a man who took power not with a ballot box but with a promise to his people, gets handed the microphone? What happens when he decides to ignore the script? On July 28, 2023, at the Russia-Africa Summit in St. Petersburg, we all found out. A young captain, dressed not in a suit but in his army's camouflage and a striking red beret, walked up to the podium. He wasn't there to play the part. He was there to point a finger. In just a few minutes, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the interim President of Burkina Faso, launched a verbal missile straight at the heart of the global power structure. It was a speech that would make millions cheer and, probably, make just as many powerful people very nervous. It was a declaration that a new generation in Africa is done asking for permission. Have you ever noticed how African leaders who stand up to the West seem to get labeled dictators almost overnight? Have you ever wondered why a continent sitting on mountains of gold, diamonds, and uranium is somehow home to the poorest people on Earth? Captain Ibrahim Traoré says he knows why. And it's an answer that a lot of people in Paris and Washington don't want you to hear. This wasn't just a speech, it was the pulling of a thread that could unravel 100 years of control. This is the story of that speech, and the uncomfortable truths it laid bare. To get why Traoré's words hit like a shockwave, you first have to understand the ground they landed on. It's a place soaked in a paradox so cruel it almost doesn't make sense. Africa. The cradle of humanity, a continent of 1.4 billion people, sitting on roughly 30% of the entire world's mineral reserves. It has most of the planet's diamonds, cobalt, and platinum. Its ground is rich with gold, uranium, and coltan, the stuff that powers our phones, our electric cars, and our entire modern lives. Its land is so fertile it could feed the world. And yet, it's a continent of hunger. It is the poorest continent on the planet. This is the wound. This is the burning question that Traoré's generation is asking. As he put it, right there on stage in Russia, my generation does not understand this. How can Africa, which has so much wealth, become the poorest continent in the world today? And why do African leaders travel the world to beg? This isn't a new problem. It's a system of poverty that was designed and maintained for centuries. It started with colonialism, when European powers carved up the continent with rulers and pencils, splitting ancient kingdoms and forcing rival groups into unstable new countries. The goal was simple: get the resources. Raw materials flowed out, expensive finished goods flowed in, and a cycle of dependency was created that was never meant to be broken. When independence came in the 20th century, the chains didn't break. They just became invisible. Welcome to the era of neocolonialism. The flags changed, but the economic rules stayed the same. Power just shifted from colonial governors to a new system run on debt, unfair trade deals, puppet leaders, and currency control. You can see it plain as day in the story of Burkina Faso itself. The country was a French colony, created in the late 19th century to serve the French economy. Even after getting independence in 1960, the relationship never became a partnership of equals. It was still a master-servant dynamic. This is the world Ibrahim Traoré was born into. A world where his country produces tons of gold, but its people stay poor. A world where the wealth right under their feet gets funneled away to foreign capitals. The terrorism that has torn the Sahel apart for a decade is a direct result of this. Traoré and others argue it isn't some random plague of violence. It's the result of destabilization, a chaos that is allowed to continue, maybe even encouraged, because it creates the perfect cover for more exploitation. A country in chaos can't control its own minds. It can't build a future. It has to depend on foreign armies, digging itself deeper into the hole. French military operations like Barkhane were sold as counterterrorism, but to many people on the ground, they looked more like an occupying force protecting foreign minds than local people. The resentment just grew and grew. The failures of these foreign-led missions became impossible to ignore. People got tired of their home being a battlefield for someone else's war. This is the wound Traoré's speech was meant to lance. The paradox of a rich continent full of poor people isn't an accident. It is, as he and a growing number of Africans see it, a carefully maintained global injustice. And that is the system he stood up to confront. The second Russia-Africa summit in July 2023 was supposed to be a showcase for Moscow. Delegations from 49 African countries were there, including 17 heads of state. The room was full of the continent's elder statesmen, leaders who had spent decades mastering the art of saying nothing, of speaking in polite, careful codes. Into this room walked Captain Ibrahim Traoré. At 35, he was the youngest leader there, and maybe the only one who felt like he had nothing left to lose. He'd come to power less than a year before, in a coup promising to finally do something about the violence and restore some dignity to his nation. He wasn't a politician. He was a soldier who had seen the old ways fail on the battlefield. He started his speech by apologizing to his elders, a nod to African tradition. "I would like to apologize to any elders who may be offended by my forthcoming comments," he said. But what came next wasn't an apology. It was a detonation. His first target wasn't the West. It was the other African leaders in the room. He asked the question that millions of young Africans ask every single day. We do not understand how Africa, with so much wealth on our soil, is today the poorest continent. And how come there are heads of state all over the world begging? That word, begging, just hung there in the air. You just don't do that. Leaders don't publicly call each other beggars. But Traoré wasn't just talking to the men in the room, he was talking to the kids on the streets of Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey. He was speaking their frustration, their shame at seeing their leaders fly around the world, hat in hand, asking for aid while their own land held all the wealth they needed. The response from some was quick. Senegal's President Macky Sall, a key ally of the West, later felt the need to say, African leaders did not come here to beg. But it was too late. Traoré had shattered the illusion. He had exposed the deep divide between an older generation, seen as too cozy with the old colonial powers, and a new one that wants a clean break. After pointing out the symptoms, Traoré went after the disease, imperialism. And now, he was aiming right at the West, especially France. He then delivered one of the most powerful lines of the speech, flipping the West's narrative on its head. We are surprised to see the imperialists refer to these VDP, volunteers for the defense of the homeland, as the militias. It is disappointing, because in Europe, when the people take up arms to defend their homeland, they are referred to as patriots. Our grandfathers were deported to save Europe, but on our return, when we decide to defend ourselves, we are called militias. It was brilliant. In one sentence, he reminded Europe of Africa's forgotten sacrifice in World War II and exposed the hypocritical double standard used to dismiss Africans defending their own homes. He was saying, we are patriots, and we don't care about your condescending labels anymore. Then came the hammer blow, aimed at the leaders in the room he saw as part of the problem. The real problem is seeing African leaders who do nothing for their people's fight but echo the same sentiments as the imperialists. We, African leaders, must stop behaving like puppets who dance whenever the imperialists pull the strings. Puppets. He called them puppets. He was basically accusing them of treason against Africa, of caring more about their relationships with Paris than the lives of their own people. And this wasn't just talk. Traoré had already kicked the 400 French Special Forces troops out of Burkina Faso. He was tearing down the foundation of France's military presence in the Sahel, a system many call, Francafrique, France's unofficial empire over its old colonies. A key part of this system is the CFA franc. It's a currency used by 14 African nations that was created back in 1945. For decades, these countries had to deposit 50% of their foreign reserves in the French treasury. Critics call it monetary colonialism, arguing it prevents countries from controlling their own economic destiny and basically gives France a veto over their financial policies. By calling out the begging and the puppets, Traoré was attacking the very structures, like the CFA franc and one-sided defense deals, that keep this dependency going. He was declaring that time was up. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a revolution. A speech that only criticizes can start a fire, but it can't build a house. What made Traoré's speech so powerful was that after tearing the old system down, he started laying the bricks for a new one. His vision is built on three main ideas: self-sufficiency, Pan-African power, and a world with more than one superpower. The first idea, self-sufficiency, is the answer to the shame of begging. He made this crystal clear when he thanked Russia for an offer of free grain, but immediately turned it into a challenge to his fellow African leaders. He said the offer is also a message to our African heads of state, because at the next forum, we must not come here without having ensured the self-sufficiency of the food supply for our people. He was basically saying, thank you, but we should be embarrassed that we even need this. Our number one goal must be to feed ourselves. This isn't just talk. Back home, Traoré's government has made agriculture a top priority. They've launched initiatives aimed at boosting local farming to achieve food sovereignty, a playbook written by Thomas Sankara. Sankara, the revolutionary leader of Burkina Faso in the 80s, is the hero of this new movement. He famously said, "He who feeds you, controls you." Traoré is putting that idea into action, pushing for local production of everything from food to cotton, trying to keep the value of his country's resources inside his country. The second idea is Pan-African sovereignty, a vision of Africa for Africans. Traoré knows a small country like Burkina Faso can't stand alone against global giants. Unity is the only defense. That's the idea behind the Alliance of Sahel States, AES. Formed in September 2023, the AES is a confederation of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. All three are run by military governments that have kicked out French troops. It started as a defense pact. An attack on one is an attack on all, but the vision is much bigger. They've announced plans for greater economic and political union, and there is serious talk of creating a new common currency to finally escape the CFA franc. They've also discussed forming a confederal investment bank to fund their own projects, without needing the IMF or World Bank. In January 2024, the three nations withdrew from the West African bloc ECOWAS, which they see as a tool of Western interests, signaling they were serious about building a new alliance based on their own terms. The third and final piece of his vision is embracing a multipolar world. He gave this speech in Russia for a reason. He's not swapping one colonial master for another. He's diversifying. As he said in the speech, he wants to weave very good relations with new partners based on respect. He knows the world isn't just about the US and Europe anymore. Powers like Russia, China, and others offer different options for investment and security. For Traoré, it's not about ideology, it's about having choices. It's about making the world compete for Africa's partnership, where African nations are no longer beggars but valued partners. By moving to take more control over key gold mines, he's making sure that future deals will be on Burkina Faso's terms, with the profits going to Burkinabe schools and hospitals, not foreign shareholders. He's rejecting the world order as it's been since the Cold War. He's saying Africa will no longer be a chessboard for other powers to play on. It will be a player, with its own interests and its own will. A speech is just words until it makes an echo. And the echo from Traoré's speech was deafening. Across the Sahel, young people who had been waiting for a leader to finally speak their language of defiance exploded with support. In the streets of Ouagadougou and Bamako, he became an icon overnight. They saw him as the return of Thomas Sankara, the man who stood up and was killed for it. This time, the people seemed determined to make sure history doesn't repeat itself. The reaction from the West was exactly what you'd expect, alarm. The old playbook was dusted off. Western media, which barely mentioned Burkina Faso before, suddenly started painting Traoré as a dangerous dictator, a Russian puppet, an enemy of democracy. The head of the U.S. Africa Command called his government dangerous. The question is, dangerous to who? Dangerous to the people of Burkina Faso, or dangerous to an old system of resource extraction? This is the classic strategy. Think of Gaddafi, who wanted a gold-backed African currency, He was branded a tyrant before the bombs fell. Sankara was demonized before he was assassinated. The script is always the same. First, you delegitimize the leader. You frame their calls for sovereignty as a power grab. You isolate them. Then, you wait for them to fall. The information war today is fierce. Fake quotes and manipulated videos pop up online trying to make Traoré look unhinged or to discredit him. But something is different this time. Unlike in Sankara's day, information flows everywhere. Traoré's supporters are fighting back online. His speeches get millions of views on TikTok and YouTube, completely bypassing the old media gatekeepers. A new generation of Africans isn't just listening to stories from the BBC or CNN, they're making and sharing their own. They are the ones connecting the dots between negative press coverage and their leader's latest move to reclaim a gold mine. Meanwhile, many other African leaders have been silent. While their people might be cheering for Traoré, the presidential palaces are quiet. They're often trapped by foreign debt, dependent on Western aid, or hosting foreign military bases. They might admire Traoré's courage in private, but they're too scared to support him in public. This fight for Africa's future is really a fight over the story. It's a battle between the old narrative of African helplessness and a new one of African defiance. The outcome is anything but certain. The old guard is powerful, but this new generation is finding its voice, and it's getting louder every single day. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's speech was more than just a speech. It was a psychological break. It was a declaration that the mental chains of colonialism, the feeling of inferiority, the idea that Africa has to accept a backseat role in the world, were finally being shattered. He said out loud what millions have felt for generations, that a slave who can't bring himself to revolt doesn't deserve to be pitied. And Africa, he declared, is done asking for pity. He is a young man carrying the weight of an old dream, the dream of Sankara, of Lumumba, of a truly free and united continent. To his supporters, he's a symbol of hope. To his critics, he's a reckless force who's tearing everything down. But maybe he's just a mirror, reflecting the anger and the hopes of a continent that is finally waking up. He isn't the cause of this awakening, he's a result of it. The path he's on is incredibly dangerous. History shows us that leaders who talk like this often pay a terrible price. But the revolutionary slogan his movement has adopted, "Homeland or death, we shall overcome," is now an anthem for a generation. A generation across a continent that is standing up and deciding that it will no longer beg for a seat at the table. It will build its own. A new generation is finding its voice. The only question now is, who is listening? And more importantly, who is afraid of what they have to say? What do you think of Captain Traoré's message? Let us know in the comments.